Okay. Um, I guess, yeah, so I'll just walk through what this is the PSF Subtraction Imaging Exoplanets tutorial. Hopefully this one is pretty straightforward. The main tutorial notebook doesn't have any uh you should be able to just run everything and it should just run. Of course, you should understand what is you're looking at, but otherwise everything should just run from start to finish. So hopefully that'll make it easier for the in the session. Um, before you run this notebook, as you can see from the top, you have to run this setup notebook first. So the setup notebook is mainly just to download the bits files from online onto your Google Drive. Um, we'll need all this data for because we're doing PSF subtraction on real data, not fake data. So we're actually downloading two different nights of data on a star HR 8799. This star already is known to have 4 planets. This data was taken with the Keck telescope. So this is all real data, which has already like these are things that have been published published already, but we're gonna re-reduce the data and refine the planets and study them and remeasure them ourselves. So the setup notebook is to basically get all of this data downloaded. It's kind of big. It's over a gigabyte. Um, and also to install various Python packages that you'll need for the workshop for the specific hands-on session. So I'm not going to run through that here, but we've tested this and hopefully this should work. So if anyone runs into any issues, please let us know. And I do encourage you to do all that beforehand because downloading those big files does take a little bit of time because, like I said, they're over a gigabyte. Okay, so once you have that, then assuming you're doing this also Google Colab, we'll follow the one we'll only execute the cells with the orange buttons first for setup. So um, so first, we had to reinstall pyklip. Pyklip is the package that we'll be using to do PSF subtraction and to also to basically remove the bright glare of the star and to also measure the positions of the planets. So this is the bulk of the data reduction and activity is going to be done with this package. Uh, Once you install that package, then you just need to mount your Google Drive. So presumably you've already run the setup notebook, you've already downloaded all the FITS files. You only have to do that once. After you do that, you just have to mount your Google Drive so that we can access those FITS files that you've downloaded, and the next 3 cells here do exactly that. And then once you do that, now we're going to try. We can skip this blue cell. This is for people that are running it on their own computer. I probably recommend you all to run it on Colab if you can. Some of the steps will take quite a few gigabytes of RAM, and you might run out of RAM on your laptop if you try to do it all on your laptop, depending on how much RAM your laptop has. So we've tested it and it does work on Colab, so I recommend you running things on Colab just to avoid any issues with running out of memory or things like that. If participants run into that issue, and they're running on their laptop, the first thing I would suggest them to do is to go run it on Colab instead. How much RAM are we talking about? If you have 64 gigabytes of RAM, you're probably fine. I'm thinking of like normal laptops nowadays have like 8 or 16 gigabytes of RAM. I've definitely run out of RAM with 16 gigabytes of RAM before, but I think with 64 you should be fine. You can also see how much RAM Colab has if you just click on the side here. Actually, Colab says they only have 12.7. Okay, so maybe my laptop only has 8 gigabytes of RAM, but Colab says here they have 12.7 gigabytes of RAM, and that was fine for them. So if you have 64 gigabytes of RAM, you probably are okay. I think the issue for me is like I'm running also like web browsers and everything else that's taking RAM. So if you're doing this on top of everything else, or like running Zoom on the side, you might run out of RAM doing all those things together. It's just a careful thing of note. Otherwise, if you are running it through a notebook on your laptop and it works fine, then you're probably fine. Okay, so the first thing we'll do, we'll just import a bunch of packages we'll need. Hopefully, this is all the imports we'll do for the uh, entire notebook. So assuming all these imports are fine, that means everything has installed properly. Um, so we can just click the run button. So this is where the live demo is going to start. Hopefully nothing crashes, fingers crossed. So first we'll just import everything. You can see we're just importing some default packages like AstroPy, SciPy, NumPy, and then mostly we're importing a bunch of pyklip modules that we'll be using to do all the various steps. The first step we'll do is just to read in all the necessary data. For I guess if you're not familiar with high contrast imaging data, this will probably be talked more during the Sagan Summer Workshop as part of the lecture leading up to the hands-on session on Tuesday. But basically, there's three different kinds of things that we'll be reading in the data. First is a time series of all the science data. So this is a 3D cube where your two dimensions is just x, y, your images of the star that you're taking, and the third dimension is time. So you have basically a stack of images through time. Um, the second piece of data that we have is an image of the star that's not blocked by the coronagraph. This tells us how bright the star is if we weren't blocking out the star so that we can see planets around it. The third thing is it's a 1D array of what's called parallactic angles. These angles specify how the sky is rotating for each of the exposures. So the sky is rotating because these telescopes are on Earth and the Earth rotates. So from our perspective, we see the sky is rotating even though the Earth is the one actually doing the rotation. We actually use this to help us disentangle the glare of the star from various planets in our data. Again, this will be discussed more on Tuesday in the morning leading up to the hands-on session. But we'll be reading in all three of these various files. Is there a question? Okay. So we'll be reading in all these three various files. You downloaded data for two separate data sets, one taken in 2009, one taken in 2021, I believe. Where for the purposes of the hands-on session on Tuesday, we're going to focus only on the 2009 data, just to process one epoch. So we're going to read in all the data, and this block of code also reads in the data and also plots a couple of things. So first, you see this is a plot of one of the science frames. So I said the science frames are a three-dimensional cube through time. Here we're just looking at the first image, so the first image taken in time. Here you can see the central star, and then the dynamic range of this plot is not very good, but here around it, you can kind of see maybe the glare of the star, some of this diffracted starlight, and underneath that glare are planets that we're going to try to find. The second frame that gets outputted is the calibration frame. This is the image of the star without having any part of it blocked out. So this is just to print it out to make sure that these frames look relatively okay. The purpose of these plots is just to make sure we've successfully read in the data and the data is in the right format. And you can see here, this is kind of what you're expecting. As long as you see something like this, we're okay. We can move on. Okay, so once we read in the data so we read in the data from these FITS files into NumPy arrays. The next step is to load those NumPy arrays into pyklip. So that's all done here. So we've created a dataset object in pyklip. This dataset object will contain all the input data, all the output data. So it is kind of like the central piece dataset that gets passed around in pyklip. The next step will take a little bit of time. This is where we actually are running principal component analysis to remove the glare of the star. This is kind of the core of the pyklip algorithm. this might take a little bit to run. I probably should have ran this before we started just to have something already finished, but you can kind of, I guess we'll pause here while it's running. And if anyone has any questions right now, I'm happy to answer any questions. This will take probably a couple of minutes. There are no questions. Yeah, you can see here our RAM is being used. You can see we've spiked up from 1 gigabyte to 5.5 gigabytes. So we've used 4 gigabytes of RAM to basically do this step right here. So this is where memory management, this is the main step where I worry about memory management. Okay, I guess while we're waiting here, I'll just give a kind of brief outline of what goes on afterwards. So even though this is kind of the core of the algorithm to remove the glare of the star, there's a lot of steps that we have to do to image planets afterwards to kind of characterize them and to measure the sensitivity of our data set. So that's all the rest of the steps is kind of doing all those various other things. So even though we've already, like very early on in the notebook, already subtracted out the glare of the star to try to look for planets, there's going to be a lot more things that we're going to cover beyond just subtracting off the glare of the star.
I guess if you take up time
Mhm.
later on, you ask about opening up like a FITS file to get the pixel values of the planets. How do we do that in Colab?
That's a great question. You can't do that in code. You could either write a bunch of Python code and to try to like get the location of the pixel of in the FITS files, or just download the FITS files and open them up yourself in a FITS viewer like DS9.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's probably the other way to do it is to basically use import it in with the AstroPy Fits IO library, and then basically you can either plot the image or start printing out parts of the image to get the figure out like what is the pixel value that you're interested in basically.
Okay.
And here you can see an example where I'm plotting one of the image cubes and putting it, cropping it to be, near the center where the star is, and just plotting that specific region of the image cube. Yeah. But I believe this again is a case where, if they're not in the default case, all of the values should be already specified for them. So there's nothing they need to change the first time around when they're running the notebook. Okay.
Sorry, another question. I probably missed this part, but we have to run both these notebooks before the workshop, before the session starts, or are we doing it during the session?
We'll be running this notebook during the session, basically. That's the core of the session, the Tuesday session.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to add, if you are here, you're a helper for the hands-on session. So preferably, please run this before the session so that if you have any questions, you can still ask on the Slack channels we have for all the hands-on sessions. So during the workshop, you can help others if they have questions.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you should at least run it through once yourself so that you can so you know what's going on basically. But all the participants will be running this during the hands-on session in real time. Okay, so it has finished. You see it took about 4 minutes. So that's kind of the rough expectation for how long this will take. if people are worried about things not running. It does print things every once in a while, so as long as it's continuing to print things, we're doing probably okay. All right, so once we have that, the dataset object that we've been using now has an output array that we can be using to look at the output images. So we can combine these images in time and look at them. So here's an output image. You can see there are 4 planets. The 4th planet might be a little bit harder to see if you're not used to it. So this is, I guess, a good question for this. I don't believe we ever specify where all the 4 planets are. So this is something for the participants to kind of go and actually try to find themselves, is to identify all the planets. So just to give you guys the answers, there's the outermost planet is here, second one is here, third one is here, and the 4th one, which is pretty close to the star, is here. This 4th one sometimes is a little easier to miss compared to the other 3, but those should be the locations of the 4 planets in the data. I think, yes. So if anyone has any questions about that, that's where they are. I imagine that for people not used to direct imaging data the first time, they may miss this last one. Once we do that, the next thing we're going to do is just to show how we can measure the position and flux of a planet. I think we're going to do it on this planet out here. This is called Planet C, HR 8799C. So this is where I think someone asked the question about like inspecting the images. This is where if you were to do it for any other planet other than C, you will need to change some numbers here. So we basically need to start with an initial guess for where the planet is in the data in order to be able to accurately measure its position. So here we've already specified an initial guess for the X and Y position and the flux for planet C. So the planet is roughly at 575 pixels in X. It's roughly at 583 pixels in Y, and it has a rough flux about 800 counts. So this is stuff I manually found by kind of roughly looking at the images, and I think I actually did it by just plotting the images in this Jupyter notebook and kind of just zooming in onto a cut around this planet, and then just kind of picking out the pixel values near that very zoomed in version of the plot. So this is kind of using some matplotlib, changing axis ranges to kind of figure out, where exactly this planet is. Because at this large of a zoom away from the star, it's really hard to kind of accurately read off the planet's position, and you'll need the planet's position to definitely less than 10 pixels in order for the planet's position and brightness to be measured correctly. Like I said, this notebook is designed to be run all the way through without having to change anything. So the participants don't have to do any of that in order to correctly measure the separation and position angle of the planet C here. The code works straight out of the box, but if they were to ever change it to try to do something else, that's how you would change it to go and find another planet's position or brightness. All right, seems like okay, good. I'm just catching my questions to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, so this allows you to measure the separation and positioning angle of the planet, and this will be used this will be used in one of the group projects if they're trying to measure the orbits of the planet. So this is one of the things that could be useful later for the group projects. The next thing we do is to measure the signal to noise ratio of the planet. The signal to noise ratio is one of the important quantities for direct imaging, because this is what we're using to actually measure how significant a detection is. We generally want to detect a planet with a signal to noise ratio generally greater than 5. So it means that the planet is 5 times brighter than the noise. So in order to measure the signal to noise of the planet, we're gonna do this somewhat rigorously. So even those that may have done some direct imaging in the past, you might have not seen everything here. So the first thing we're gonna do is to run a planet detection algorithm onto the image. And what I mean by that is that we're going to we're going to smooth, we'll basically run what's called a cross correlation of the output image, which is this image. You can see there's a bunch of noise. It's a lot of like salt and pepper noise, and a lot of that noise isn't actually, our planets we know aren't that scale. We know our planets look like these circular blobs. So all this salt and pepper noise can be averaged away because we know that this kind of salt and pepper noise shouldn't, any brightness intensity changes here aren't reflective of a real planet. We can actually average that out. So what we do is basically we cross correlate the entire image with the image of the star. The image of the star is also a fairly good representation of what the image of each of these planets, the pattern of what each of these planets should look like. So we do this cross correlation across the entire image to kind of smooth out the noise. So you can see here, before we had all this salt and pepper like pixel to pixel noise, and now all of that has been smoothed out by running this cross correlation routine. So this will give us a slightly better detection sensitivity because we removed all this kind of pixel to pixel noise in our images. So that's just showing you what the images look like after running that cross correlation routine. Again, you can see the 4 planets, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The 4th one's a little bit harder to spot than the other 3. So the next thing we have to do is to create a noise map, signal to noise map. Signal to noise maps are basically taking your cross correlation map and for each pixel computing the noise of each pixel and dividing this cross correlation map by its noise. So we're normalizing the map because we know that further out the noise is lower. So a lower intensity pixels could result in a good enough detection. Whereas when you're really close to the star, the noise is a lot higher. So even if you have a bright pixel like this one, this may not correspond to a real detection just because, not only is the signals brighter here, but the noise is also brighter here. So we're compensating for the fact that the noise changes. And in particular, we're assuming that the noise is kind of only changes radially as a function of the star. So as we get further and further from the star, the noise gets lower and lower. But we are assuming that the noise, at this angle versus at this position angle is the same. So we're assuming that noise is azimuthally symmetric. And when we do that, we can create a signal to noise map. So again, this is this image divided by the noise map. So what you can see here is that the kind of signals at the outskirts of the image are more enhanced because the signals at the outskirts of the image have less noise. So any corresponding bright pixel is more significant. So again, the first 3 planets, B, C, and D, are very easily detected in our signals noise maps. But the last planet, E, you can see is a very marginal detection. You can barely see it in the signals and noise map. This is in contrast to our initial image here, where all 4 planets have almost the same brightness. This is because even though this planet is pretty bright, the noise around at the same separation as the planet is almost equally as bright. So we can't tell for sure if this is a real planet or not. We know now it is a real planet, but this is why in the initial discovery paper for this system, HR 8799, the first paper only reported the discoveries of the first 3 planets because this 4th planet was not as significant. If you run the other data set, the 2021 data set, you'll see that this planet is a lot brighter in the 2021 data set and is a lot more detectable. But in this initial data set that we're running as part of the tutorial for the Tuesday session, you can see that it's a much weaker detection. Okay, so we have the signal to noise map, and then running this cell will allow us to measure the signal to noise of planet C. This is the same planet that we just measured the position of. So if you do change, your guess X and Y and your guess flux here, you'll also change which planet gets its signal to noise measured down here. But again, if you don't change anything, we're measuring the position and flux of planet C, and now we're measuring the signal to noise of planet C. You can see that planet C has a signal to noise of 8.6. This is above what I said. Normally, we want a detection of above 5, so this tells us that we have a good detection of planet C. So a big part of PSF subtraction, I'm sure this will be covered again in the Tuesday morning session to talk a bit more about why this all happens, but doing the PSF subtraction process also distorts your images and attenuates the flux of any real astrophysical signal. So if you were to actually really, in truth, measure the flux of if you were to measure the flux of a planet here at face value, the flux you'll measure is actually lower than the true flux of the planet. This is because the PSF subtraction process actually suppresses some of the flux of the planet in addition to suppressing the glare of the star. So in order to kind of fix that, we have to calibrate for it, and we calibrate for it by injecting fake planets into the data. Okay, looks like we have some questions. Before I dive into this, let's go look at the answer to the question. So the guess flux for the flux of the central pixel or the flux of the total companion? That's a good question. It is the guess flux for the flux of the central pixel. It doesn't have to be super accurate. You could be off by factors of 2 or 3, and it's totally fine. You can be off by a factor of 10, it's probably okay. But let's not be at too. Yeah, we should try to be as accurate as we can. But it's a guess flux for the central pixel. Since the images are rotated versions of each other, when we estimate the noise per pixel is the variance between frames of the same CCD pixel. Very good question. It is since the images, we are basically assuming the noise in the images are azimuthally symmetric, that for every annulus of the image, every pixel in that annulus, the noise of every pixel in that annulus is drawn from the same noise distribution. So even though the fact that the images are rotating in time, it doesn't really matter that we're actually picking different CCD pixels for each of the different frames, because we're making the assumption that for all the pixels in the same annulus, it's being drawn from the same noise distribution. So it's totally okay to estimate the noise in the way that we're currently doing it. And it's a pretty good approximation. So this is generally what's done in the field for many published scientific papers. Okay. So the next step we have to do for PSF for all kind of high contrast PSF subtraction processing is we have to inject simulated planets into the data, planets that we inject of known brightness, and then measure these simulated planet properties after we injected those planets to kind of calibrate their planet properties. Since we know how bright we injected them in, we're going to measure their flux, and it's going to be slightly lower. And the difference, the signal to loss in between, that's the attenuation of the flux due to just this data reduction process alone. And then we can use that to calibrate our real planet properties. Since we know the fake planet was supposed to be this bright, and it actually was this bright instead, and it's this lower brightness when we measured it into the data. We can then look at our measured brightness of our real planets in the data and use that same correction factor to bring it back to the true planet brightness of the real planets into the data. So that's what this whole paragraph is trying to explain. So we inject fake planets into the data. So in this case, we're going to inject 2 fake planets into the data. We're going to inject one. We're going to, again, this code here all relies on so each planet in the data will have to have its own fake planets injected in for calibration. Here, since we've been doing all of our analysis for HR 8799C, this planet, we're going to inject 2 planets, one at this location and one at this location. So 90 degrees away from the planet with the same brightness at the planet run PSF subtraction, inject those into the raw data, the original FITS files, run PSF subtraction again, measure their brightness after PSF subtraction, and basically use that to calibrate the flux of this planet because they're at the same azimuth of mesh separation. We're assuming kind of all of our data reduction algorithms and noise behaves the same for everything in the same annulus. So we're going to inject these two simulated planets, one at +90 and one at -90 degrees. If you measure a different planet in the data, this simulated planets will be injected for that. So if you instead measured B out here, the simulated planets will be injected here and here instead. You measure D, the simulated planets will be measured here and here again instead. But again, the default notebook is designed so that you don't have to change anything when it runs. So by default, everyone should be measuring this planet. So the simulated planets we're injecting are going to be here and here in the data. So we're gonna I should have just ran this while I was talking. So basically we inject, so we basically are gonna inject, we're gonna create a copy of the original data set, and which we're gonna call fakes data set, and we're gonna inject those two fake planets into that new data set object, just so that we don't contaminate our old data set object. And then we're going to run the PSF subtraction routine again, this PCA stuff. Again, is going to take a couple of minutes. Again, you can look at your RAM usage, and you can see now, because we created a second data set to inject fake planets into, our RAM usage has gone up again. So we've gone from 4 GB now up to 7 GB. So you can see how if you had other stuff running on your computer, you might start running out of memory sooner or later. So this is going to, again, take a couple of minutes, so I'm happy to answer questions while this is running. So the first question is, what are the IWA and OWA arguments? Great questions. There are a lot of arguments that kind of swept under the hood just because we're not really going to change them for either the main session or for the group projects, but I'm happy to answer questions about as many of them as people have questions about. IWA and OWA are terms inner working angle and outer working angle. It specifies basically how close into the star we want to run PSF subtraction. You can imagine, at the location of the star, we're not going to be sensitive to any planets, so there's no point in running PSF subtraction at the location of the star. And the outer working angle specifies how far out we want to go. This generally corresponds to close to the size of the image, but sometimes if your planets are really close in and you have a lot of detector pixels further out that are just not detecting anything, you can specify your outer working angle to be smaller, so that will just save you some time. And that's what we're doing here. So we're specifying our inner working angle to be 25 pixels from the star. So we're not going to do any data processing of any pixels within 25 pixels of the star. And we specify our outer working angle to be 250 pixels from the star. So you can see here in this SNR map, you can see this is our inner working angle and this is our outer working angle. If you are trying to assess the phi sigma contrast limit on a data set with no planets and have to calibrate against self-subtraction, is there a rule of thumb for how bright your planets should be and how many you should inject? If you're talking about for real science data, you want to inject your planets at roughly your 5 sigma detection limit. So even with, you're going to have to experiment a little bit because you don't know a priori the first time around how much signal loss or signal attenuation you get from the PSF subtraction process. You're going to have to guess. And after you inject that first planet of known brightness and see how much flux it decreases, then you'll know how much signal loss there is roughly, and you can inject planets at roughly 5-ish sigma, so right around the detection limits for the most accurate measurements. And then you want to inject as many planets as you can. The more planets obviously takes more computation time, but injecting 2 planets like we're doing here is just for demonstration purposes. I would basically never inject less than like 8 or 10 planets per annulus when trying to measure things. Things like the noise, just because there's inherent uncertainties to measurements of standard deviation when you have less than, say, 10 samples. There's more details about this, I think, in the pyklip documentation. So if you go read there, you can actually learn more about. There'll be more discussions about some of these things, I believe. Okay. So it looks like our fake data set finished running. So like I said, we've, in addition to the 4 real planets now, we've also have 2 fake planets. It's hard to tell the difference between real and fake planets. That means we've done a good job. So this one and this one are the fake planets. So there's 6 planets in the data now, 4 are real, 2 simulated planets. So now we're going to measure the properties of the fake planets. Again, nothing has to be changed here. We know that the fake planets are injected at the same separation as the real planet. The only thing that's changed is their position angle. So what is their azimuthal orientation relative to the north? And we know that one of them has been moved by plus 90 degrees and one has been moved by minus 90 degrees. So we do that, and we can measure the separations, position angles, and fluxes of the fake planets. So that's what we're putting in these arrays. These arrays just have 2 elements in them. And then what we're actually trying to do is we want to measure the real planet's planet to star flux ratio. And we do that by measuring planet flux, the star's flux, and measuring this term called algorithm throughput. That's the term for, if we injected the planet at this brightness and we measured it after PSF subtraction to be this brightness, this drop in brightness, what is that throughput factor? It's a value between 0 and 1. So if your flux dropped by 30%, then your algorithm throughput is 0.7. If your flux dropped by 50%, then your algorithm throughput is 0.5. So that's the quantity that we're going to measure with the fake planet. So we know if we take the mean of the measured fake planet fluxes, and we know what is their injected flux, what the value is that we injected them at, we know then the algorithm throughput. And then once we take that algorithm throughput, we can take the real planet flux. We can take the flux of the star, and when we take the algorithm throughput and we combine them together, we can measure the real planet to star flux ratio. The flux of the star is a little bit tricky. So we have to measure first the flux of the star in our star frame. This is our calibration frame, but this calibration frame is taken with a different exposure time. So we have to correct for the difference in exposure time between this frame and that frame. And that's what's also done here. So once we do that, so that's why we're dividing the peak star flux by the exposure time, and we're also dividing by the planet flux by its exposure time. And now that we've normalized both by their respective exposure times, we can divide the two, correct for algorithm throughput. And once we have that, you can see that we measured an algorithm throughput of 0.5, and we measured a planet to star flux ratio of 1.8 times 10 to the minus 4. That's roughly the numbers you should expect. About 2 times 10 to the minus 4, that's good. And having an algorithm throughput about 50% is kind of expected for this procedure called angular differential imaging, where we're using the fact that the planet is rotating because the Earth is rotating. So that's good. So this allows us to measure the true astrophysical flux ratio of the planet. So that the planet is at about 2 times 10 to the minus 4 times fainter than the star at this particular wavelength, which is L band, or about 3.4 microns. So you can pat yourselves on the back here. You've measured a real astrophysical quantity of a real planet here. The next thing we can do is just how like the flux is biased, the position of the planet could also be biased due to the PSF subtraction process. So again, we can use the same fake planets we injected to measure the separations after PSF subtraction and compare that to the separation that we expect before PSF subtraction. And we can do both of these. And you can see that we've measured a bias of negative 0.35 milliarc seconds and a PA bias of 0.05. Oops, this is actually I should fix this. This is actually a typo. It should be degrees. So I'll go fix that in the notebook after this. These values are actually very small. You can compare that against the uncertainties in the separation in PA. So we measure the uncertainties in the separation in PA by just taking the standard deviation, the scatter in the various separation and PA measurements. So we know what the true separations are, we know what the true PAs are, and then for our fake planets, we measure the PA and separation that's not exactly the true separation PA that we injected them at. So we can use that error in the measurement of the fake planets to kind of understand what is the measurement error in our ability to measure the separation in PA of these planets. And you can see that the errors are about 1.6 million arc seconds and 0.045 degrees. You can see that those values are actually much larger than our separation and bias values, our separation and PA bias values. So basically, the bias values are basically zero. Like we can, as we say, as mentioned here, we can safely say that the bias is zero because the bias is much smaller than our uncertainties, and we can't. It's at a point where we can't really measure a non-zero deviation of the bias values. Yes, I use error and uncertainty interchangeably, so I will try to use whatever is actually written, which is, I guess, uncertainty. But both of those values mean the same thing, at least in my book. Okay, so now that we've actually measured, this is like everything we want to measure for a planet. We measure its position, we measure its flux ratio. Those are real astrophysical quantities, and we can use to do other analysis. After, let's close this. Close this. Okay. After we do that, the other thing we can measure from this data set, we really are measuring everything we can from this data set. The other thing we can measure from the data set are contrast curves. Contrast curves basically specify the sensitivity to planets in our data set. We generally produce 1D contrast curves. 1D contrast curves is the sensitivity to planets as a function of separation from the star. Like I mentioned before, we kind of assume our noise is azimuthally symmetric. So that means that we don't need to specify for each pixel, how sensitive we are for planets. We can specify, here for each separation, how sensitive we are to planets. We can assume that all pixels of the same separation have roughly the same sensitivity. This is not exactly true, but it's good enough for almost all intents and purposes. So here we can generate a 1D contrast curve. It's a little bit ugly because there are real planets in the data. There's planet E, D, C, and B here in the data, and this is just the edge of the detector. And because of that, our contrast curves kind of spike up every time there's a real planet. If you were doing this for real, we would mask all the real planets and do this again after masking all the real planets. But for this purpose of this demonstration, this is good enough. You can see that the contrast curve is we have a function to measure the noise in the data, but like I mentioned before, the noise in the data, just like how the signal, the flux of the planets are attenuated in the data, the noise is also attenuated, and the noise is attenuated in the same way by this algorithm throughput factor. So if we take so we also have to apply this algorithm the same way we apply the algorithm throughput factor to the flux measurements. We also apply it to the contrast curves. The contrast curves, the y-axis is planet to star flux ratio. So just like how we had to normalize by the star brightness, we have to do that again for the contrast curves in order to put this into astrophysical units. So as a function of separation from the star, I do need to fix a couple typos. These are pixels. Function of separation from the star, we're plotting the planet to star flux ratio, the faintest planet to star flux ratio that we can detect. Okay, so there's a question, does the algo throughput change significantly by separation? Do you estimate the algo throughput for each fake injected planet? The answer is yes. the algorithm throughput does change quite a lot as a function of separation sometimes. So you have to inject a bunch of planets at a bunch of different separations if you're doing this for a real astrophysical analysis. But for the purposes of the demonstration, we don't really want to spend all that time running clip over and over and over again. So we're just using those same two fake planets that we injected once and applying that correction across the entire contrast curve. But if you're doing this for real, you want to inject planets here and 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 here. Probably inject more than 2 planets to measure the algorithm throughput term. Okay, so that's the last thing in the tutorial notebook. So the main things in the tutorial notebook are to measure the signal to noise of all your companions, to then inject fake planets into the data so that you can measure the flux ratios of the real companions, measure the separation and position angle of the real companions, and also to measure the contrast curves of the data to quantify the sensitivity of the data to planets. So that's everything in the tutorial notebook. That's what we're planning to run through on Tuesday for everyone. And this part is not, it's fairly linear. They don't have to change anything. It's just kind of more conceptual questions that people might run into that we'll need to help answer. Then if folks are interested, we can talk about the various group projects that need to be done, that can be done. I guess I'll pause here to see if there's any other questions about this section. Can I say more about what is going on under the hood when you do PSF subtraction with clip? I think that will be discussed more in the Tuesday morning tutorials. I don't have anything here. We're just treating it as a black box. Basically, what you're doing is for every image, you take all the other images in this temporal sequence. It's gonna be hard to explain. But basically, we're computing a set of principal components for each image that represent the image of the star, and trying to describe the image of the star that we see in this particular image with a linear combination of all the other reference images that we've accumulated, and then use the PCA algorithm or clip to basically filter those reference images to look for the most common spatial patterns and to subtract off those most common spatial patterns. Okay, there's a general question. There are a lot of tools to perform ADI PSF subtraction, like Pinpoint. As someone relatively new to the field, I'm just wondering what are the main reasons, benefits of using pyklip. Yeah, lots of people have their own PSF subtraction packages. The reason why we're using pyklip because I wrote pyklip and they asked me to do the tutorial, so we're using pyklip is kind of the simple answer. Yeah, basically we could be doing this with various other PSF subtraction packages, but I think each person is most comfortable with their own PSF subtraction package, so that's why we're using pyklip. And I think based on the previous data challenges we've done, most of these PSF subtraction algorithms work pretty comparably. So there's not a huge reason to use one over the other, unless I think it's less about algorithm performance and more about which package you're more used to, or you like the API of the package better, like how it's used to how it's set up to do various tasks and whether those tasks are suitable for you or not. I think those are the main things I would say distinguish the packages. Okay. All right, let's talk about the group project ideas. So I gave 4 possible group projects of increasing difficulty, or what I think is increasing difficulty. Oh, there's another question. Are there some PSF subtraction methods that would be more optimal depending on the context? There are, but we are not really going into them for the purposes of this demonstration. I think that gets a little too into the weeds. I think Clip and PCA does a pretty good job for a lot of purposes, and then people are working on more specialized algorithms for more specialized purposes. But I don't think any one of them is sufficiently mainstream, commonly broadly used across the entire field enough that we need to talk about those. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about the group project ideas. Like I said, the increase in difficulty from easier to harder. So the first 2, they just need to modify this notebook basically to do things. So the first one is to compare, and I think I supplied answer notebooks for all of these, so you can take a look at those. But I'm just going to outline briefly what's going to happen for each of these 4. So compare planet SNR between epochs. So in the data you downloaded, there's also a 2021 data set. So run clip on the 2021 data set, measure the signal noise of the planet in the same planet in the 2021 data set. Is the signal to noise better or worse? And note that your personal computer may run out of memory. The 2021 data set is a bit larger, so if you don't run out of memory here, you can see we're already taking about 5 gigabytes. You might have there's a chance you'll run out of memory on the larger data set. But this is pretty straightforward. There's not too much you have to change. There's only 2 things, right? So the first thing is that we have to read in the 2011 data set. So you have the 2021 data set, so you have to change these values to 2021. Do that 3 different places. Otherwise, the data is in the exact same format, so nothing else needs to be changed here. You can load in the data and plot them again just to make sure they look vaguely okay. You can read them into pyklip the same way. You run clip dataset the same way. You can look at the output images the same way. The thing to note is that between 2009 and 2021, there is orbital motion for the 4 planets. So all 4 planets have moved. The innermost planets move faster, so the innermost planets have moved more than the outermost planets, but all 4 of these planets will be at different pixel locations. So because of that, you'll definitely need to change. Even if you're measuring the signal noise of the same planet, like planet C, you're definitely going to have to change guess X and guess Y to be different values. And those different values, that working different values, are in the answer notebook. So you can always refer to that. But basically what I would do is either use, zoom in on here and look at the pixel values close into the planet in the 2021 data set to see what the pixel values are. Or download the FITS file and open it up in DS9 to do the same thing. But those are the only 2 things you need to change. And then after you run this, you should be able to run again your planet detection algorithm and remeasure your SNR map and compute your planet signal to noise and see how much the planet SNR changes between the 2 epochs. So that's all there is. You just need to run down to here for the second epoch, and then that's all that project is asking for. Okay, so that's the first project. If people, if the group members are very efficient at that, they can do this for all 4 planets, and so that means measuring the SNR for each planet for both epochs. So they'll have to measure 8 different SNRs and compare them and see if the SNR changes are the same across the 4 planets. And I think the answer is no, but that's up for them to figure out. It's a research question. The second group project is how do the contrast curves change if you use different PSF subtraction parameters. So pick one of the following parameters of clip dataset, which I guess I'll explain now. Annualize number of annuluses to break the image up into. So we run clip on each annulus separately. And this allows us to do better local optimization, because you can imagine you're trying to optimize and subtract off the entire PSF. You have different behaviors happening close in and further out, and you may not be as effective in trying to find a image that subtracts off all of the PSF of the star all at once. So we're going to focus on optimizing the closer in parts first, and then move ourselves further and further out. So I think we have a default value, and then you can try changing this to see how much this affects how it affects your contrast curve. And then you could also change movement, or you can change num basis. Movement is how many pixels a hypothetical planet should have moved before we use it as a reference image for angular differential imaging. So this is basically the fact that the sky rotates, but we want to use images where the planet has also rotated sufficiently away from the science image. I guess it should be explained Tuesday morning as well. Basically, movement controls how far away in time the reference images we use for PCA are. If you pick images too far away in time, your stellar PSF will have changed, which means that your stellar PSF subtraction will not be as effective, because you're using images where the stellar PSF has changed considerably due to the fact that the atmosphere has changed considerably. However, if you pick images too close in time, the Earth hasn't rotated enough for the astrophysical source for like a real planet to have rotated, which means that you'll be taking images where the planet in your reference images is on top of the real location of the planet, which means that your planet can subtract itself out when you're using angular differential imaging. So there's a kind of trade-off in kind of picking a value that's greater than 0, but for movement, but so that you're not subtracting off the planet completely, but picking a value not too large, so that we're actually using images where the PSF of the star is still pretty closely representative of the real PSF. It does say in this group project idea that if you don't know which one to do, try setting movement to 0. So this is the extreme case where we're going to use images, including the images where the planet hasn't rotated at all, to do PSF subtraction. It turns out this is still okay, and some but it's probably not going to. It's probably still being okay. So the question is, how much better or worse does your PSF subtraction get when you do this very extreme case? And the third one is num basis. Num basis is the number of KL modes, a number of PCA modes to use to model your PSF. So the more PCA modes you use, the more kind of possible various structures for the PSF you're going to model. This is good because that means you can model more of the variations in your PSF. The caveat is that the more basis vectors you use, the more chance you have for overfitting. So you have all these various different patterns of your stellar PSF that you can possibly use to subtract off the image. Some of those patterns will start looking like planets. And so you'll end up subtracting off your planet signal if you start using too many basis vectors. So you'll basically get what's called overfitting. So again, all these values have optimum that are probably not 0 and probably not 1,000,000, but the goal is for the groups to pick one of these for the same 2009 data set, rerun clip and recompute a contrast curve with one of these changed, and see how much that affects their sensitivity plots. So you can see, if you go back up here, the default values are, we have 11 annuli. Our num basis, we're effectively using the last value in the num basis vector. Yes, so for changing num basis, I guess this is something to clarify this is why we had this meeting. You only need to change this last one, because we're only using this last one. You can change it to 20, you can change it to 20, you can change it to 10, you can change it to 500, but pick a value there. The only caveat is that max num basis needs to be as large or larger than the maximum value of your num basis vector. So if you change this to 500, you're going to need to change this to 500 as well. But these are, these are parameters, these are kind of expert kind of level parameters. So we're letting people kind of play around with some of these more parameters and depending on and tweaking around things. So there's chances of things getting broken, but in general, they either need to change this with the caveat that they might need to change this, or they need to change this. So movement starts out at 1 pixels. The unit of movement is pixels. You can change it to 0 pixels. You can move it to 0.5 pixels, 0.1 pixels, 2 pixels, 5 pixels, 10 pixels. Those are all reasonable values to try. And you can see how much better or worse your PSF subtraction gets by changing that parameter. I recommend trying some more extreme values, and you can really notice the differences. Okay, so that's group project number 2. You can see that it's so they're gonna do that, they're gonna rerun, they're gonna change those parameters, get a new image, and they can actually skip a bunch of steps. They can skip all the signal to noise steps. What we want to do is then inject fake planets and rerun the fake planets with the same parameter. So if we change annuli, if you change num basis, max num basis, or movement, those need to be changed in exactly the same way here. I realize, do I have another typo? This should be 50. I think. But so make sure that the parameters they use further up are exactly the same as the parameters they use further down here. And as long as that is true, then they just need to rerun the fake planet injection. They have to remeasure the properties of the fake planets. They can skip the next two and then just go straight to the contrast curve and update the contrast curve. So in the end, those should have 2 contrast curves plotted on top of each other and see which one is better than the other. So that's the second. That's the second project. The third and fourth projects get a little bit harder in that they have to then use other notebooks. So let's open these. The third project is to estimate the mass of a planet. It's asking you to measure the flux ratio of the outermost planet. Note that you'll need to measure and correct algorithm throughput for this planet separately. Using the flux ratio, use the isochrones notebook to derive a planet mass for both planets. So that's the planet C and planet D, planet C and planet B. How do they compare to the values in the literature? So here to measure the flux of the outermost planet, like we've discussed already, you just need to change this value to be the guess values for the position of this planet. It looks like it's roughly at like 370 in X and 590, 580 in Y. So you have to change those, measure its flux, run another round of fake planets, injecting fake planets at the same separation as the outermost planet, and then use that to measure the flux ratio of the outermost planet, having remeasured the algorithm throughput for having measured the algorithm throughput for the outermost planet as well. So that you'll have to run all of those steps. And then you'll need to open up the planet to get the flux ratio of planet C and planet B. Then you can open up the planet isochrones notebook. This is using the species package to then basically compare the flux ratios you measure against planet evolutionary models to derive masses. And there's only this notebook you can just basically run straight through with. There's only one thing we'll need to change, and that is the planet flux ratio. So I just made up a value here. You want to insert your measured planet flux ratio here instead. It will take that planet flux ratio, use the stars L-band magnitude to convert that flux ratio into an absolute L-band magnitude for the planet and use that to compare against evolutionary models to derive a mass. So all the rest of this is straightforward and you can just run through it. The only thing that people need to change is that for each planet, in order for them to measure the mass, they have to change this planet flux ratio parameter. And this is, again, in the answer keys. So the answer keys have these changed with the real masses, with the real flux ratios that I measured. Okay. And the last one is the most involved, I would say. In the data you downloaded, there's a 2021 data set. For one of the planets, measure its relative astrometry in both the 2009 and 2021 data. You should reduce the 2021 data in the same way you reduce the 2009 data. So basically, we've measured a separation and position angle for, say, planet C already in the 2009 data. So then we'll need to load in the 2021 data, reduce it the same way, change our guess X and Y position because the planet C will have moved in the 2021 data. We'll remeasure its separation and position angle. You want to be fully thorough. You'll probably also want to inject fake planets in the 2021 data to make sure that the bias and separation on the separation and PA of the planet is relatively close to 0. I can tell you the answer is yes, but if you want to be thorough, you can do that. And then once you have the separation and PA of the planet in both the 2009 and 2021 epoch, so all you're trying to get from this notebook is basically these values. Once you have those values, you can then open up the orbit fitting notebook. You can set up the orbit fitting notebook as you can see here. And the main thing you'll need to do is create an orbitized data file. So this is in the answer keys for what the real one should look like for planet C. But you'll need to basically put your astrometry that you measured into this format. The format is a CSV file for the epoch, the object, separation, sep error, PA error. So for the epoch, I think we tell you that in 2009, the MJD for the epoch is 55137, and for 2021, the MJD for the epoch is 59404. So you'll need 2 rows, one for each epoch. The first epoch is 55137. So you need to replace that here. The object will always be 1 because we're only fitting 1 planet at a time in our orbit fits. The separation is whatever separation you measured in your notebook. So if you go back here, we measure separation at 945.09 milliarc seconds. So that should be put here. The error on the separation, we do technically measure an error with the 2 fake planets we injected, but it's not very accurate. But I guess we're gonna just use it. So we're gonna use the error in separation that we measured. So I think we measured an error in separation. If you go down to this part of the notebook, we measured an error in separation of 1.6 milliarc seconds and measured an error in PA of 0.45. So we'll put the error in separation as 1.6. We'll put the PA of the planet, and then we'll put the PA error as 0.45. And then we'll repeat that for the second epoch, the 2021 epoch as well. So we'll have 2 rows. So this is just a data entry, but you have to make sure all of those values are inputted into this small table. So we'll need to run this orbit fit. So then we'll just need to set up and run the orbit fit. So we import a bunch of packages, import some packages. We'll use the orbitized orbit fitting package. We input that CSV file. It's currently set to be called example astrometry.csv, but if you create your own CSV file and call it something else, you'll need to change the file name. You'll need to change the entire file path here to be the path to that file. So here we're using the example astrometry from the orbitized default data dir. So you want to delete basically all of this so that, and basically create your own CSV file, upload it into your Google Colab file directory. So you want to upload it into here, and then basically replace this whole thing with the name of that CSV file that you make. So we shouldn't be using the example one at all. Another challenge for the group project is that the total mass and parallax of the system are totally wrong here. So they're going to need to look in the literature to find out what is the total mass of the HR 8799 system. It's basically the mass of the star. So they need to look up what the mass of the star is for the HR 8799 system. They also need to know what the parallax of the HR 8799 system is in milliarc seconds. Then we have this is a little bit of an exercise. I'll just let them, I would like to have them kind of dig into the literature, maybe look at the NASA exoplanet archive to try to find these values. But the values that I used are in the answer key, so you can always refer to them for what the real value for these two values are. But so they'll need to change this, and they'll need to change this and this for the code to run. So it's not just putting one thing in and running it. You have to change several different things. Once you change that, you can then find a bunch of orbits. We're going to find 1,000 possible orbits for this planet, and then we're going to plot those orbits here. And let's see, the notebook, it just asks you to, I believe, make a plot of what the orbit looks like and record your estimated semi-major axis. So here, this thing will plot what the orbit looks like on the sky, and this code down here will also print out what the median semi-major axis of the planet's orbit that we inferred is. So they can do that all through the existing code. So this part, they will, okay, I was wondering about this. Sorry, I did mislead you one little bit. So finding orbits for planets sometimes gets a little tricky, especially when you have a little bit longer orbital coverage. To speed this up, we're going to inflate the errors. We're going to inflate the errors on the SEP error and PA error that we have here. So even though we measured errors that are pretty small, about 1 milliarc second in separation and 0.4, 0.3 degrees in PA, we're going to use anomaly 10 milliarc seconds as the separation error and 1 degree as the PA error. So instead of using what the fake planets tell us, with those two fake planets, we're going to basically set SEP error to be 10 and PA error to be 1. And this will speed up the orbit fitting process and make it a lot faster. So it's still going to be fine. It's just going to make it a little bit quicker and make things hopefully a little bit easier. So that's what all 4 group projects are. And then for each group project, there's always a little bit of a bonus, just in case people finish early and have other things to do. They basically there's always more work that they can be doing. They can they can look at different ages for this star and the planet masses thing. They can rerun the orbit fit for all 4 planets and compare them against the literature. They can try 5 different values when they change PSF subtraction parameters. They can measure the signal to noise for all 4 planets when they're just measuring planet SNRs between epochs. So this will hopefully give people a little bit of flexibility, and for people that have really sped through the group projects, there's more for them to work on. Okay, I think that's everything. Happy to answer any more questions or things like that.
Thank you, Jason. Does anybody have any question here? Just a reminder that we do have a Slack workspace for the SIG and SUM workshop. So you should have got an email for the invitation to join the Slack workspace. So please join in there. We have a hands-on helpers private channel there. So when you are continuing testing the workbook. If you have any questions, you can always ask on the Slack channels there. Is there
And
any?
I'm going to upload a few typo corrections as we found them onto the GitHub, and hopefully those get propagated through. Just FYI to Melanie.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll look out for them. I'll send you an email also just to follow up.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, the question is how to add the Slack chat, how to be added to the private channel. So I can, if you haven't received the link, or if you couldn't find the July update email, I will send an email out to all the hands-on helpers in a bit with the invitation link there. So you can join the Slack by clicking on that link. And once you join, I will be able to add you to the private channel. Okay, is there any more question?
There was one about looks like about whether the helpers are supposed to help during the group sessions as well.
Yes. Yes. But just want to let everybody know that, you know, being a helper doesn't mean like, you know, you are excluded from doing the group projects yourself. You're still welcome to, encouraged actually, to participate in all the hands-on sessions and group projects. Okay, so if there's no more question, let's thank Jason again. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for volunteering to be a hands-on helper and for joining us today. The next 2 training sessions, one is scheduled on Wednesday. That's on the optical model, and the one is scheduled on Thursday morning, same time, 8 a.m. Pacific time. The Thursday one is gonna be on the yield modeling. So yeah, once you join the Slack channel, I will also post reminders there. Yeah, thank you everyone.